class, we're going to be talking about interviews and observations, qualitative methods, and data collection. Some of the features of qualitative methods we've discussed and are likely clear to many of you. The collection of qualitative data is certainly distinct from quantitative data. It really uses this idea of the exploratory research question that we've talked about and inductive processes. We often are focusing on previously unstudied processes and unanticipated phenomena. So this is in line with the exploratory and inductive process that there may not be much known, and so it's important to collect data to generate some better theory and understanding of a given phenomenon. And then lastly, the orientation is more in the social context, that a phenomenon that you're interested in is really embedded in a particular social situation, and that's part of what you are wanting to explore and flesh out with qualitative methods. Some of the other features include things like the human subjectivity, really understanding the participant's perspective, idiographic causal explanations. So again, this idea that often we're interested in causal relationships, and we can understand those from an individual's narrative perspective of their perception or perceived causality between events, and then also thinking about reflexivity as part of the research design. Some of the basic structures of qualitative methods in terms of studies include things like case studies. So we're focusing on a single unit or observation here, maybe that's a group, and the analyst is really considering that individual or the unit really as a particular unit and something that needs to be studied unto itself in a fair level of depth. Some other ideas include things like a thick description. Thick is an adjective that is not typically used in research, but it is in terms of qualitative data, which is to say that we often want really deep, rich, complex narratives about the understanding of the phenomena that we're trying to investigate, so that it becomes really clear through that description, and that there's such richness that it really conveys directly what the phenomenon is of interest. And you could imagine that this is in contrast to a thin description that offers really little context and understanding. And so what we're looking for in terms of the quality of data and the depth of data is really something that is more thickly described. Ethnography is a particular kind of study. It often is considered as synonymous with qualitative methods, sort of erroneously, but it is instead really a study of culture. You can think about kind of classic anthropological studies like Margaret Mead. So someone who's studying the culture that some group of people share, and often it's through a really extended period of time of embeddedness, both combining participant observation and or interviewing, and really kind of living within a new community or group for such a long period of time that you're really kind of embedded there. Netnography is the same idea, but really studying online communities rather than ethnography that tends to be more an in-person kind of manifestation or data collection process. Another potential method is photo voice, that uses photography, particularly participant-driven photography, where the participants in the project are tasked to or pose themselves a research question that they're interested in, and they generate photographs that really represent their understanding, their lived experience of that given phenomenon. And then those photos are collected together, and that those photographs become the data that then generate the themes through which we can get a more qualitative understanding of their social reality. For participant observation, which is one of the classic data collection types for qualitative methods, it's really important to be clear about what your role is as the observer. Are you involved in the sort of situation that you're observing? Are you actually an outsider? processes of entering the field. So how do you gain access? How do you become build relationships, or how do you maintain those relationships? Things like sampling. How do you find people and events to go and observe? The processes of taking notes when you're doing observation can be really awkward. And so often people are engaged in observation without taking direct notes, and sometimes even sort of run off to the bathroom and scribble down some notes and then potentially come back, so that it's less clear that you are standing in the corner observing everything all of the time, but instead you're more naturally in the setting that you are trying to understand. Managing the personal dimensions, again, especially if it's an over a period of time where you're doing observations, that those there can be sort of this blending of the personal and the professional, and then also thinking about systematic observations. So if you're trying to observe the same classroom on a daily basis and doing it very systematically to look for specific kinds of behaviors, that's a particular very systematic, which is to say, repeatable and a very manualized sort of approach to observation, which is often different than the kinds of observations that naturally occur more. So again, in terms of choosing that role, you have a few different possibilities. There's covert observation, complete observation, participant observation, where you're sort of more embedded, but you're off to the side, and then covert participation, where you're participating in the activity or the group, but without disclosing that you are doing participant observation sort of research. In terms of sampling and events, we tend to think about theoretical sampling, which is to say that you have an understanding or a phenomena that you're interested in understanding, and you are theoretically sampling events and participants whom you can observe, who will help elucidate that mechanism. So you're not using a probability sample here, and quite the opposite. In fact, you are trying to sample very theoretically to get your observations to come from a place that best understand the phenomena that you're interested in. Again, taking notes, thinking about jotting versus field notes, and there become a lot of ethical issues in terms of some observations and ethnography around field notes. You're probably not able to take direct quotes, but you can jot down things that you think are reflective of the tone or key words, versus field notes that are much more comprehensive and often kind of are a summary of that particular day or the particular observation kind of setting that you were in, if you were at a meeting or something along those lines. Intensive interviewing is then the kind of core idea of a lot of in-depth or semi-structured one-on-one interviewing rather than participant observation. So this tends to include open-ended, relatively unstructured questions where the interviewer is really trying to get an in-depth insight from the interviewee's feelings, experiences, and perceptions. The whole point of the interview is to understand the participant's perspective and to ask questions that will help prompt that, and then to follow up and probe on those ideas based on where the interviewee is kind of taking you. That's the open-ended and the unstructured piece. So the pros and cons of interviewing online and doing interviewing online has become more popular. The pros and cons are you have a sort of perfect written record of the interview process automatically if you were doing interviewing by chat, for instance. But then you also lose a lot of the nuance of an in-person interaction. When it's just over chat, you don't have body language, you don't have the tone of voice, or the kind of extent of the pauses or the reasons for pausing. So there are two different types of interviewing online that you could use, which is synchronous or asynchronous. The synchronous approaches are using online chatting or texting, and asynchronous are more emailing or online forums. In other words, the asynchronous is that you send an email and then the person responds at some point later, or you post in an online forum and then you wait for replies, versus a more simultaneous, immediate kind of in real time of online chatting or texting. Focus groups are the other more common in-person data collection method, and they use an unstructured group, so it's similar in structure that to an interview where it's open-ended questions, but and somewhat unstructured in terms of where the conversation will go. But the focus group is really led by a specific person who facilitates the group, and their role is to encourage discussion among the participants on the topics of interest. So not necessarily just kind of a ping pong, if you will, of the facilitator asking a question and each individual answering, or that there's discussion back and forth between the facilitator and an individual, but instead the facilitator's role is really to get a group discussion that's happening and for there to be a fair amount of of crosstalk between participants in the group. Community-based participatory research is one place where qualitative methods often come up and really shine, in part because they are capitalizing on and really leveraging that same sense of the interviewee's perspective at the center that qualitative methods are as well. And so these are a collaborative approach where the researcher and the community members are both participating and being researchers. So community members are really thought of as experts and as equals and peers with the researchers, that the community members have a substantial amount of input and insight into how to craft the questions, how to craft the data collection tools and methods. And this can often be a way to work with under-researched or communities that are kind of skeptical to research, is to instead use the community-based participatory approach to decentralize the role of the researcher and use that sort of position to enter the community in a way that makes the community expert, rather than coming in with a more positivist kind of approach. But instead, your goal is to get the community members able to pose and answer research questions that are really of importance to them. And so you can see how that mirrors the qualitative perspective. This notion from Engel and Schutt about a diverse society sort of dovetails off of the community-based participatory research because it centers the perspectives and the point of views of the participants and interviewees rather than the researcher and the set of fixed questions that we'll talk about when we're talking about surveys, but instead are really flexible and open in their orientation such that the interviewees' perspectives and expertise of their lived experience can really shine through. And so there are a lot of opportunities and I think really great ways to capitalize on using qualitative research methods in order to investigate lived experiences that aren't necessarily the kinds of things that lend themselves to quantitative research studies, but they also can inform quantitative research studies. So thinking about how qualitative work can inform a better scale that you could use in a quantitative study may be one way of conceptualizing it, or to help unpack quantitative work. So we'll talk a little bit more about mixed methods designs later. And then qualitative methods can really be helpful for things about evidence-based practice, particularly things like some process evaluation, some feedback that the clients are offering around manualized intervention for evidence-based practices, and to understand why those who are in need of services aren't getting the help that they need, things like fidelity to the treatment, so using qualitative methods of either observations or focus groups of those who are delivering evidence-based interventions to ensure how they are adhering to the manual and delivering the same intervention as all of the other providers on the intervention. So this was a quick overview of qualitative methods. We breezed through participant observations, in-depth interviews, and focus groups being the three most common. They get employed in community-based participatory research and also in ways that can be kind of mixed methods research. And then those all sort of have implications for a variety of different dimensions for social work research, including evidence-based practice.